Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 455. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing today?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show. We got quite a bit to get into today, but I just want to remind people that we are hosting our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, and this week we have matching funds. So if you make your donation today, the donation gets doubled. Donate $25, it becomes $50. $100 is $200. $1,000 is $2,000. So head on over to the Institute. Help us to meet our goal. We put all of your money to good use, putting out the strongest, most important libertarian content in the movement today. And Connor, with that, let's talk about one of the recent articles that you wrote for the Institute. This one titled White House Bats Renewal of Law Enabling Spying on Americans Amid FBI Scandals. So Connor, what's going on here?
Yeah, so we've been covering this whole debate going on in Congress about whether or not to renew Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. And of course, there's been a great deal of pushback now, thankfully, from members of the Republican House, like Representative Matt Gaetz, for instance, who are pushing back on not just what was done to Donald Trump and his and the subversion of his administration and his campaign via the whole Russia hoax, the whole Russiagate hoax, but also the spying on Black Lives Matter protesters and January 6 protesters, and so political dissidents on the left and right. And last week we talked about how the new revelation is that the FBI was caught snooping, doing unauthorized, improper searches, as they call them, on U.S. lawmakers last year, including a U.S. senator, a state senator, and a state-level judge. So with that in mind, this week, of course, the Joe Biden administration put out a report recommending a renewal of 702, even though you've got some Democrats that are against the renewal because they're at least good on civil liberties in some instances. We can appreciate that. But also, these Republicans are now turning against it. And we talked about how the Times had excoriated these GOP members for all of a sudden being good on surveillance for the first time. So the Biden administration is stepping in. And previously, they were trying to just say, oh, it's China, China, China. We got to protect ourselves from China. Don't you understand that, you right-wingers? But so now they put out this new report. So as I write, the Joe Biden administration released a report endorsing the renewal of this controversial law, which enables U.S. intelligence agencies to spy on foreign nationals and American citizens on Monday. And this comes amid this heated debate in Congress regarding how surveillance powers are weaponized against the American people, as well as a slew of scandals involving these capabilities being wielded by the FBI against protesters and lawmakers. So published by the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and Intelligence Oversight Board, the 42-page report states that a failure of Congress to renew Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act before it expires at the end of the year would constitute, quote, one of the worst intelligence failures of our time. So Section 702 authorizes a tool used by the U.S. spy agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance on foreign targets and any Americans with whom they may be interacting. The practice has long been criticized by domestic civil liberties groups because in the process, of course, also collected our American citizens' electronic communications, including our phone calls, text messages, and emails. So unless reauthorized in December, the law will expire, and this is going to be complicated as growing animosity over the spy bureaucracy's abuse of power continues to prompt stiff opposition and demands for extensive reforms from lawmakers across the aisle and particularly the GOP. So most recently, there was this declassified court document that revealed the FBI improperly searched a surveillance database created by Section 702 to search information about a U.S. senator, a state senator, and that state-level judge. A senior FBI official made clear to Politico that the unnamed FBI analyst who snooped on the U.S. senator and the state senator was not authorized to conduct these searches using, quote, sensitive query terms, including the names of people running for office or public officials. Now, the improper searches did not even meet, reportedly, the threshold of being, quote, reasonably likely to retrieve evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. And so despite the claim in the disclosure that the analyst had evidence that these officials were being targeted by a foreign spy service, the aforementioned FBI official speaking with Politico said that he conceded that even if the analyst had sought the required pre-approval from the deputy director for these queries, they, quote, would not have been approved. So even in light of all this rampant misconduct, such as the targeting of the January 6th protesters and the Black Lives Matter protesters during the George Floyd, all the protests and I guess, the riots in 2020 as well. But during recent years, the White House's report says, even though you have the FBI treating people like this, FBI personnel should receive additional training on what foreign intelligence entails. The administration does acknowledge, however, that the Bureau's conduct undermined public confidence in its ability to use Section 702 in the way it was intended. So they're admitting that, of course, that there is this. I mean, it's a huge stain on everybody already knew they couldn't trust the FBI, but for a long time, Democrats were really, especially with Russiagate, all of a sudden they had found God, and our God was the national security state. And now this is all being sort of torn apart as you see that really the national security state is being wielded domestically against dissidents of all stripes. No, not just in a partisan basis. They go after the Trump supporters and the Black Lives Matter protesters, and even people in their own ranks, like senators, for instance, are not off limits. And so I think that this report is not going to have any real impact. It's pretty funny that their recommendation is that, well, we just need more training. That should fix it. Just let them know what foreign intelligence entails. It doesn't entail spying on Americans and going through all their electronic communications records and things like this. So I think as we look toward December, we've got a good chance, hopefully, for more, because I'm sure there's going to be more stories like this and more scandals. And there should be a good movement to help support any of these dissidents in the House, saying that no, they don't want to renew this at the end of the year. And they're demanding major reforms preventing things like this happening. And so it remains to be seen if that's possible. But the best case scenario would be just not to renew the law. And as Matt Gaetz said, it's his position is that it doesn't matter who it's being used against. He's abhorred by all of it. And he said, you couldn't waterboard me into reauthorizing Section 702. And there's some Democrats saying the same things, that absent these significant reforms that prevent and prohibit these kind of practices being taken by the FBI, these infringements on people's rights, that they just won't renew it. And it's surprising, too, because sometimes it's even like Russia hawks that are saying this stuff, like Jason Crow, for instance. All right. So, and then we have this next story. Speaking of, because the Biden administration is trying to make it all about China, and we have to be prepared. If we don't reauthorize 702, we'll be even more vulnerable to the Reds. Speaking of that, the military is becoming less and less popular in the United States, and they're having a lot of trouble coming up with ways to boost recruitment. So now what's being discussed is reinstituting the draft. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on August 1st. Military.com op-ed calls for military draft. So Dave writes, an op-ed published by military.com called for the U.S. military to restart the draft amid a recruiting crisis resulting from decades of endless wars in the Middle East and Africa and skyrocketing veteran suicide rates. And the fastest and most effective way to resolve this recruiting crisis is to change how we recruit, wrote Jill Plenzer, a retired Marine lieutenant colonel. So Plenzer called for something in between an all-volunteer force and a fully conscripted force. And of course, the U.S. draft was abolished in 1973 after years of conscripted Americans being killed in the Vietnam War. And so Plenzer writes, we should have our military recruiters sign up new troops for 11 months out of the year, and then have the selective service draft the delta between the military's needs and the total number recruited. Plenzer said his proposal, quote, this is incredible, would alleviate the incredible pressure on our recruiters, lower the cost of finding new troops, and significantly reducing the much decried civilian military gap by subjecting all of America's youth, rich and poor, to the possibility of military service via the draft. The op-ed comes after President Biden called up 3,000 reservists to make available for the Pentagon to deploy to Europe, signaling the military is struggling to maintain its current force posture. Since around the time Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has deployed an additional 20,000 troops to Europe, and amid the recruiting crisis, a poll from Gallup, which we'll get into more here in a second, published on July 31st, found that confidence in the U.S. military is at its lowest point in more than 2 decades. The poll found that 60% of the U.S. public trusted the military. It's even lower among independents. This is the lowest level we've seen since 1997. And so there's some great analysis here in this piece from Kelly Vlahos at Responsible Statecraft called Americans' Trust in Military Hits Malaise-Era Territory, so just after the Vietnam War. And so what she goes into more about the poll. She says the new Gallup poll has found that 60% of American public trust, only 60% of the American public trusts the military, still over 50%, but a far cry from the 70% just 2 years ago in 2021, and an even further fall from the 80+ figures just a decade ago. And this drop is seen among all party affiliations. Currently, Republicans are at 68%, according to the poll, Democrats 62%, and independents 55%. So further, Gallup points out that the last time it dipped to 60% or below was in 1997. It actually lingered below 60% during the late 1970s, the post-Vietnam phase when the military was transformed into an all-volunteer force and the nation was racked by what Carter was calling a crisis of confidence, later coined the Great Malaise. And so the left claims, we always hear that from Republicans especially, that, well, the military has gone woke, and that's why nobody wants to join up anymore. And the left will say that it's because there's racism and inequality in the military. And so, the idea that this would make up for the 25% shortfall in recruitment deserves significant skepticism. And as Kelly says, beware of partisan narratives that appear to speak for everyone and explain things so neatly. Never is anything so simple. And so she says the truth is the country is 2 years fresh out of a war that lasted 2 decades. While Afghanistan was an endless churn of personnel rotations, military families back home suffered under the strain of divorce, financial fragility, and a one-parent home life. Veterans returned with injuries inside and out. We know the suicide rates among these troops, especially from Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had 30,000 troops come home and kill themselves. Kids grew up in these conditions. Moreover, the Iraq War, which overlapped Afghanistan for half a dozen years, is now deemed a failure. And this is no ringing endorsement for 18-year-olds who have to read dusty old history books and watch movies to understand what it was like to win, to be the good guys in a heroic narrative. And these things matter. So she quotes the great Afghan War whistleblower, former Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who says that the cat is out of the bag on how deceptive the military and Washington have been for the last 20 years of the global war on terror. It's seeped into the bloodstream. No one can fairly or accurately pinpoint what is at the core of the slipping trust numbers, but one can't and shouldn't count out this new post-Great War on Terror, global war on terror malaise. He says, I've been arguing for well over a decade that the penchant of our senior military leaders to deceive the American public about the course of our wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and support in Yemen and the Libya wars continues to deteriorate that level of trust. Add in the continuing deception by various administrations, and the American people will continue shedding trust. Then Brandon Buck, who's, of course, been on this show. He's a PhD candidate in history and an Army veteran who served multiple tours in Afghanistan. He says that a disproportionate number of Americans from the South and Midwest served in these war on terror wars, and they have been increasingly disenchanted with their role. So Brandon says, in the wake of the global war on terror, a well-deserved crisis of confidence in Washington, a disproportionate burden of casualties, and far less compelling foreign policy message, one should not expect the same enthusiasm for America's century-old warrior class. As we find ourselves further from memories of the good war and deeper in a disaggregated narrative landscape brought on by the internet, one should not be surprised that the trends of the past fade away. And you can add that to the continuing feeling that our leadership isn't being straightforward or even honest about current operations or endless proxy wars overseas, says Davis. Trust must be earned back, but that process can't even start until we first stop the bleeding by being straight with the American people and quit trying to put on a good face on everything that happens, even when it's ugly and bad, and refusing to give the hard, honest assessment. That might be the truth of the matter hiding in plain sight, though it would be a shock to if anyone with the power to change things, admitted it. And of course, when we see these reports like earlier this year come out from the Cost of War Project at Brown University that show that 4.5 million people have died directly or indirectly in these post 9/11 war zones. I mean, the American people don't want to be. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I think a great many of members of my generation and yours, Kyle, didn't want to join the military after 9/11 because we had heard about what had happened in Vietnam and we had some sort of social consciousness about that. And I can't imagine what it would be like now for 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and 17-year-olds who probably know people in these areas in their neighborhoods who came back from Afghanistan or came back from Somalia or came back from Iraq. And they've heard these horror stories and they know the wars were all for nothing, that it broke the economy, and that maybe they know people who killed themselves or are not getting decent health care at the VA. There's just no nobility anymore in this military service. And so they can try and pretend that it's wokeness. Like that's Ron DeSantis' answer for everything, because he's advocating the exact same policies that have completely drained our resources and sapped everybody's morale and demoralized the whole country and spent us into oblivion and killed all these people overseas and created all these massive problems. They're never. This is unfortunately the bipartisan consensus, and we need to. I'm glad to see that trust is in the military is down. It should be way lower than that, and glad to see that they're having a hard time with recruitment. But it's no doubt that it's about the legacy of these policies. It's not about racism or inequality or all these neat little excuses they can come up with, wokeness, to try and explain away the fact that people don't want to be a part of some mass murdering campaign anymore when they know that they're doing the wrong thing. I mean, I just don't see it happening. I'm sure there's some people who need to do it for benefits, but of course, that's not the whole picture.
All right, Connor, thank you for that update, and let's move on here. I just want to do an update on something I talked about on the show earlier this week, and that was when Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Australia. He was confronted on the Assange issue, and the Australian Prime Minister insists he's standing firm against the U.S. on Julian Assange. So this is interesting because, as Caitlin Johnstone often points out, Australia basically acts as a 51st or 52nd American state, and will do essentially whatever the U.S. wants, even when it's maybe counterproductive to Australian interests, like the military buildup with China. But here we have Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese saying on Tuesday that his government was taking a firm stand against the U.S. on the prosecution of Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, who is also an Australian citizen. During a recent visit to Australia, Secretary of State Antony Blinken rejected concerns raised by his Australian counterpart about Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes if he gets extradited to the U.S. from the U.K. The Australian Prime Minister told reporters on Tuesday that the U.S. case against Julian Assange has, quote, gone on for too long and enough is enough. He said Blinken's comments about Assange echo what U.S. officials have said privately about the WikiLeaks founder, and he said, we remain very firm in our view and our representations to the American government, and we will continue to do so. Now, Connor, I think the problem is if Australia is unable or unwilling to maybe make some leverage here, say, this proxy war against China is so important to you. If you want us to be involved in that, you'll drop the charges against Assange. I don't see, no matter what the Australians do, I don't see it changing the position in Washington. Moving on here, I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on August 1st. The White House is desperately seeking more artillery ammunition for Ukraine. Washington is frantically seeking to provide Kiev with more conventional 105mm artillery ammunition. Ukrainian forces are firing more rounds than the U.S. can produce, and American weapons stockpiles have reached their red line levels. According to the Financial Times, the White House is struggling to acquire more artillery shells to send to Kiev, and A U.S. official told the outlet that Washington has inked deals with South Korea and Bulgaria for 155 millimeter rounds and hopes they will make a similar agreement with Japan soon. Recently, American officials have admitted that Washington has sent Ukraine uh, all the rounds the Pentagon is willing to part with. President Joe Biden authorized sending 155 millimeter cluster rounds to Kiev to cover the shortfall. Biden is violating American law by sending the cluster munitions to Ukraine. Cluster bombs drop some munitions that often do not explode until years after the conflict, and American law says that any munitions with a dud rate of over 1% cannot be exported or transferred. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and injured by bomblets left behind from America's bombing campaigns during the Vietnam War. The Financial Times reports that Ukrainian forces are currently using about 8,000 artillery rounds per day. Currently, the U.S. could only produce about 24,000 shells per month. NATO military leaders have chastised the Ukrainian forces for relying too heavily on artillery. Ukrainian leaders complain that the Western leaders pushed them into a counteroffensive without having air power, leading Kiev to rely on other tactics. High-ranking American military officials have repeatedly claimed that Ukrainian forces have been given, quote, everything they need. However, the Wall Street Journal reported last month that Western officials knew Kiev lacked the military capability to retake Russian territory. This is from the Wall Street Journal, quote, when Ukraine launched this big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. They haven't. And so it's like, Connor, that these people only watch movies where the good guys win or something and just assumed that the tide of the battle would turn because that's what they needed to happen or something. And that it didn't matter what kind of weapons Ukraine had, which, that's of course not how things work in reality. Now, Connor, there is another maybe brewing issue here in Eastern Europe, and that is between Poland and Belarus. So Poland is rushing troops to its border, claiming Belarusian helicopters violated airspace. So on Tuesday, Poland said it was rushing more troops to its border with Belarus and accused Minsk of violating its airspace with military helicopters, and Belarusian officials denied this claim. According to Reuters, the Polish Defense Ministry said it was sending additional forces and resources, including combat helicopters, to the border. Belarus has accused Poland of making up allegations about helicopters violating its airspace to justify further buildup on the border. And then just today, Connor, I have this article that will shortly be out at the Libertarian Institute. Poland has created a new HIMAR brigade. They currently have 5 HIMAR batteries, and they're positioning that about 70 miles from the border with Belarus, which I believe will be well within the range of the ATACMS, the Army tactical missiles that Poland has for those HIMAR systems. Now, I'm not sure when the HIMARS will be in use, as they just received their first shipment of 5 HIMARS in May, and they're scheduled to get 15 more in the coming months. And they opened a HIMAR Academy, and so this is going to be some kind of semi-permanent installation in Ukraine to train, or in Poland, not Ukraine, to train Polish forces on those systems. Connor, there's been a lot of talk around what's happening with U.S. citizen Gonzo Lira, who is a reporter who has been doing some work in Ukraine. Now, Lira is certainly somebody who gives a viewpoint of the war, and you could agree or disagree with his viewpoint. But, it is a viewpoint that certainly Kiev doesn't like. Spends a lot of time exposing Ukrainian war crimes, and people will criticize him for maybe being biased and not spending enough time or the same amount of time of exposing Russian war crimes or something like that. But whatever, you kind of think of it, he is more or less serving he is a journalist operating in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is in wartime, and so, they're going to have whatever policies that they have. I guess, I'm not particularly surprised that, given what Lira has reported, that the Ukrainian, and given how Kiev has acted during the war, that Kiev has arrested him. And I know he was trying to cross into Hungary from Ukraine. And my understanding, I read a post from Mart Sloboda that said that it appears Lira has been captured. And I believe, this has happened multiple times now, that he's been captured by the Ukrainian Security Services Bureau, the SBU, and is once again in a Ukrainian jail or prison somewhere. So, this is just more exposing that Ukraine isn't some great democracy, and, it is just an authoritarian like country where, this is the kind of things that happen in authoritarian countries. All right. Another Ukrainian drone attack targets Moscow. And this happened early Tuesday morning. It's the second time in a week and the fourth time since last Monday, as Ukrainian operations inside Russia are increasing. The Russian ministry said down 2 drones, and that a third crashed into a Moscow skyscraper after being disabled by electronic warfare capabilities, and no casualties were reported. I certainly think, Connor, this is going to have a pretty major impact on how Russia decides to carry out the war. And I could kind of see 2 different routes Russia taking. Maybe they take both of them. And one is kind of tit for tat. If Ukraine hits a skyscraper in Moscow, the Kremlin is going to order airstrikes and attempt to level a major building in downtown Kiev. I don't know if they're going to do that, but I could see them taking that approach. I could also see them deciding that, look, if Ukraine is starting to target civilian targets in inside of Russia, then Moscow is going to look at their targets inside of Ukraine, and targets that maybe at one point they would have considered for so much civilian purposes that they're not going to target it with their missile strikes. Rail lines. In the morning, these could be used to take people to work. In the afternoons, they could have tanks or missiles on those rails. And so maybe Russia starts carrying out more attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine that could have some civilian purposes. So I think we're probably going to see some of those things happening as Kiev continues to ramp up its war directly attacking Russia. Connor, last article here. U.S. and Taliban officials meet. Washington slams Kabul over human rights. U.S. has met with Taliban officials in Qatar for 2 days of talks. The discussions came as Washington's economic war on Kabul has caused severe suffering for the Afghan people 2 years after the end of the U.S. military occupation. A State Department press release said the special representative for Afghanistan, Thomas West, the special envoy for Afghan women, Karen Decker, and that's Rina Amiri, and then the chief of mission to Afghanistan, Karen Decker, met with senior Taliban officials on Sunday and Monday. And I think it's worth noting here, Connor, that the Taliban did meet with a couple American officials who are women. The press release from the U.S. officials chastised the Taliban over their human rights abuses. Since returning to power in 2021, the Taliban have imposed bans preventing women from for the most part, publicly participating in society. They've been some pretty severe bans on what women are allowed to do, what kind of jobs they are allowed to hold in Afghanistan. However, Connor, we're Americans, and so we really do have to note here that Washington's human rights record in Afghanistan is also abysmal. America's 2-decade occupation of Afghanistan was marked by mass killings of civilians, torture, and support for warlords who habitually sexually abused young boys. During talks, American and Taliban officials discussed the Afghan economy, and it's really interesting here, Connor, from the Taliban press release, because they really stressed to Washington the need for the U.S. to lift sanctions, and so have international aid groups who have come out and said that the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is terrible. 95% of Afghans are not getting enough to eat, and nearly 1/2 of the population is facing acute hunger. And the U.S. has billions of dollars in Afghan central bank funds that have been frozen, and also sanctions on Afghanistan that prevent more goods from entering the country, and more different countries from providing the Taliban or Afghans with aid. Now, and maybe a little bit of a positive note here, Connor, the U.S. officials did note some positives about the Taliban rule, and that is the Taliban were not allowing anyone in Afghanistan who would threaten the United States, and that the Taliban have cracked down on poppy cultivation, which is interesting to note because the U.S. spent millions, if not billions of dollars in Afghanistan attempting to crack down on poppy cultivation, and yet they were unable to do so, Connor. And here the Taliban take power, and very quickly they're able to rein in the poppy cultivation. All right, Connor, hand it back over to you. I think you got some news on Israel.
Yes. So there's a very interesting article here from Phil Weiss at Mondo Weiss talking about specifically the temperature on the whole is on the American Israel lobby and how they're reacting to Netanyahu humiliating Biden. After this interview that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, we've seen more of these articles put out by Tom Friedman. The one last week was about how, well, actually, I discussed with him this great new idea, well, not new idea, but this great idea for Saudi-Israeli normalization, and here's all the great things we can do. And all of that seems very unlikely. But the first article was about Biden pleading with Netanyahu, Friedman's words, and the Israelis to basically not go down this path of ramming through the judicial overhaul with Netanyahu's coalition and try to build a broad consensus. And of course, after all of this, they went ahead and they passed in the Knesset the reasonableness standard law, where they basically cut the judiciary's ability to overrule decisions by the Knesset if they deem them to be unreasonable. And so they're moving forward with this judicial overhaul, completely defying Biden and making him look dumber and less, less in control than usual. And so what's really interesting is that you're seeing prominent American Zionists and members of this sort of Israeli lobby establishment coming out and saying that it might be time to cut aid to Tel Aviv over this, or that there needs to be punitive measures. And so just like with Friedman's first article, where he says that there's a risk to the special relationship, like this could, what if we don't have another pro-Israel president ever again after Joe Biden? Or what if we won't be able to maintain this special relationship we've had for 75 years with the Israelis and the Americans for another 75 years? And this hyperbolic rhetoric, Phil gives us a much more realistic interpretation, but also helps to read the room a bit more. So he says Joe Biden was humiliated by Benjamin Netanyahu yet again. Biden went out of his way last week to warn Netanyahu not to go ahead with a law that would gut the power of Israeli courts. He even called Tom Friedman into the White House to get the message to the American Jewish supporters of Israel. I'm telling Netanyahu not to do this. Netanyahu went ahead and did it anyway. And what will be the consequences? Nothing. Say 3 leading Israel advocates. Biden won't dare to spend any political capital to take on Netanyahu. The neoconservative Max Boot, of all people, in a media briefing on the crisis by the Council on Foreign Relations, said that Biden ought to discuss reducing aid to Israel, as even centrist Zionists are now saying. But he won't, because he fears Republicans who have Netanyahu's back. So Boots says, while there have been calls to limit or scale back U.S. military aid to Israel, including by Martin Indyk, which I think definitely needs to be on the table, there is no indication that Biden himself is planning to go there. This may be the right thing to do for the long-term reset of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but I don't think it's going to achieve very much in terms of the current outcome in the Knesset. Part of why Netanyahu is willing to be so confrontational with Biden, Boots says, is he feels very secure with his backing on Republicans on the Hill, who have basically adopted an Israel right or wrong position. They are indifferent to the menace that Netanyahu poses to democracy. So this gets a bit more into the fanciful narrative that Israel is this beacon of democracy in the Middle East. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see Boot talking about reducing aid to military aid to Israel as a necessary a part of a necessary long-term reset of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So then Phil writes, Aaron David Miller wrote in Foreign Policy that, quote, although Netanyahu is annoying the hell out of him, Biden's inclination is not to confront, but to find some way to accommodate. Biden's efforts to sway Netanyahu last week was unique in the annals of U.S. interventions in Israeli politics, Miller says, but Biden won't follow through and take the prime minister on because he has learned some hard lessons on the perils of taking a more confrontational approach toward Netanyahu. So these include President Obama quarreling with Netanyahu over the likely borders of a Palestinian state in 2011 and then backing down after Netanyahu lectured him. And Biden as vice president arriving in Israel in 2010 just as the government had announced new settlements. Biden had to swallow that one too. Now, Michael Koplow has a similar analysis at Israel Policy Forum. Biden quickly turned the other cheek over the latest defiance, including signaling his willingness to meet Netanyahu. So Koplow writes, anyone hoping for a revolution in U.S.-Israel relations is going to be disappointed. Irrespective of Biden's obvious frustration and his efforts to get Netanyahu to shift course, his restrained reaction to Monday's vote was a clear signal that he has no intention of overturning the apple cart. The White House's statement following the reasonableness law's passage described it as unfortunate, and the National Security Council dubbed the debates over the law and the definition of all the associated, and by definition, all of the associated upheaval as, quote, a healthy part of a vibrant democracy. In the course of a White House briefing on Monday recapping President Isaac Herzog's visit to the U.S., a National Security Council official reconfirmed that Biden and Netanyahu will meet before the end of the year. The Biden administration is not going to rethink its stance on security assistance to Israel because of the judicial overhaul, and it's also not going to react with punitive measures. The White House's reaction and much of Congress's reaction will look no different than past U.S.-Israel disputes, where there is a period of tension marked by slightly more heated rhetoric, but little beyond verbal disagreements. So then Phil says, Boot, Miller, and Koplow all say that Netanyahu has damaged the U.S.-Israel relationship in profound ways that will have a lasting impact. The widespread belief in the U.S. is that Israel as a democracy has been shattered. The next generation of Democrats have little regard for Israel. Young Jews say that Israel is an apartheid state. And we covered a couple years ago on the show how even young evangelicals are starting to that demo is no longer the Israeli lobby can no longer count on them to be as staunchly Zionist or pro-Israel, as they used to be in the past. It's really a generational shift. And so Boot says, if you care about the future of Israel and the future of the U.S.-Israel alliance, I think Israel is headed in a very dangerous direction by aligning so closely with the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, okay, and alienating a lot of the other sectors of American public opinion. I think that's going to be very bad for Israel going down the road. So the awareness that Israel just took a grievous step is now staggering the Israel lobby, Phil says. We have seen establishment organizations criticize the Israeli government that almost never do. The Jewish federations, the ADL, the American Jewish community, and Netanyahu has shown contempt for them too. So Martin Indyk said, this is a very dark day for Israel and a very momentous time in its history, unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Several Israel supporters are now calling for a cutoff in aid. Max Boot is the latest to urge such a reset, in part because Netanyahu is fostering violence in the West Bank. Boot says, I argue that Netanyahu is the biggest security threat Israel faces. Brett Stevens, even in the New York Times, calls the judicial move a self-inflicted wound and says that Israel is doing so much worse to itself than the BDS campaign ever could, including the BDS of major companies leaving Israel. So a group of liberal Zionist organizations, including J Street and New Israel Fund, have called on Biden to do more to protect Israel from its own government, though it's not at all clear what they want Biden to do to redeem Israel. They said, we welcome the expressions of deep concern from U.S. elected officials in the White House and on Capitol Hill and throughout the nation, as well as similar reactions by U.S. Jewish organizations, including ones that seldomly publicly criticized the government of Israel. We urge the Biden administration, Congress, and other elected officials and opinion leaders, as well as fellow American Jewish organizations, to help protect Israel from irresponsible actions of its current government. And so Phil says there are also obviously efforts to get the lobby back together so Democrats are not tempted to stray off the reservation. Jonathan Greenblatt and Ted Duth, the head of the ADL and the American Jewish community, have all but ignored the Israeli political crisis and have been tweeting about the Biden administration's efforts to fight anti-Semitism. So now we have Friedman and Indyk and Aaron David Miller. They've all been promoting this supposed deal for normalization between Riyadh and Tel Aviv. That'll be, of course, stage managed and facilitated by the U.S., in which Israel promises not to annex more portions of the West Bank. There's even a ridiculous part in that in that article where they say that where Freeman says that Saudi Arabia will be the other thing. It's not even clear exactly. Besides the well, I guess the Saudis are getting some great. The idea would be the concessions that they get from the Americans in terms of the security guarantees is the absolute last thing America should do. But it's interesting. Friedman offhand in that article goes, they'll also be giving a unprecedentedly huge aid infusion into institutions in the West Bank. Like, why would that be Saudi's role in the negotiation? It just doesn't make any sense. But so they're all excited about it. These even these guys who are even these mainline, pretty prominent Israel members of the Israeli, the pro-Israel establishment are saying that that's kind of the next move, that they want Biden to focus on this deal. Indyk apparently was very excited about it at this CFR briefing. But they're admitting, I guess Aaron David Miller is saying that in foreign policy that it's still a long way off. And so Phil says, my biggest criticism of all these statements is they leave out the power of the Israel lobby itself. That is surely Biden's greatest concern, the domestic political power of donors and influencers epitomized by Tom Friedman, Jonathan Greenblatt, and J Street 2. When Obama took on Netanyahu in 2011 of the West Bank, he backed down because American Jewish organizations descended on the White House, and Obama's top foreign policy aide said he was given a list of leading Jewish donors to call to reassure them of Obama's pro-Israel bona fides. And the organized power of the Jewish community in support of the Israeli government is the reason that Biden won't do anything, and idealistic Jews need to take that power on explicitly for everyone's good. So I thought that was very interesting. Of course, Biden has been so staunchly pro-Israel. His entire administration has been known for decades as Israel's man in Washington and can be counted on to do pretty much everything he's already done. It's interesting that they were, that Tom Friedman article was so melodramatic, but clearly they were trying to have some political impact and trying to send some message to Netanyahu, or maybe it was just for cover for Biden's administration to look like they weren't supporting this judicial overhaul and this threat to Israeli democracy. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see, once again, the Democrats being slapped around by Netanyahu. And so I don't know. We'll see. But it's good to see that people are actually talking about cutting aid. Of course, they're not talking about it for the right reasons. The right reasons is this is involved in this next piece from Mondo Weiss, which is an update on what's been going on in the West Bank. So this is discussing the legal and military assault on Palestinian lives, which is continuing. This is from July 27th. So Israel is continuing raids in the northern West Bank, including in Nablus and Kalakia, killing 5 Palestinians in a week. Meanwhile, the Israeli judicial overhaul continues reverberating with the adoption of a new bill. So this is just from the 24th to the 27th of last month. So on Tuesday, on the 25th, Israeli forces invaded Nablus and executed 3 Palestinian resistance fighters. The men were killed following armed confrontations with Israeli forces on Mount Gerizim, the mountain bordering the southern side of the Jordan Valley containing the city of Nablus. The slain men were identified as Montasser Bajahat Salama, who's 33, Saad al-Karaz, who's 43, and Noor al-Din Arda, who's 32. And according to eyewitnesses, the men stood together and faced off against Israeli military forces with only 3 guns. The bodies of the 3 men were taken by the Israeli military and continue to be withheld by Israeli authorities, a common punitive practice that uses Palestinian bodies as bargaining chips. The next day, on July 26, Israeli forces invaded Nablus again, shooting and killing 1 youth. On Thursday, July 27th, Israeli forces shot and killed Farish Sharabil Abu Samara, a 14-year-old, during a military invasion of the Nafar neighborhood in the northern West Bank city of Kalakia. Between Monday and Thursday, Israeli settlers intensified attacks on Palestinian towns and villages in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, always with the protection of the IDF escort. And on Wednesday, July 26, Israeli settlers joined the army and invaded the Al-Tira neighborhood of the city of Ramallah, performing prayers on a neighborhood hilltop to which settlers have routinely returned, including last year. As the settlers performed prayers in the Palestinian neighborhoods, Israeli forces fired tear gas at Palestinian youth living in the area who appeared to confront the invading force. And then one of Israel's apartheid laws has been expanded. On Tuesday, on July 25th, the Knesset also approved a second and third reading of an amendment to the Cooperative Societies Ordinance number 12, a bill sponsored by these members of the Knesset from the Religious Zionism Party, the National Unity Party, and the Jewish Power Party that aims to create criteria for excluding those deemed unsuitable to live in communities in the Galilee and the Nakab. The bill is a nakedly racist attempt to take over Palestinian land by excluding Palestinians from living in the Galilee and the Nakab based on preserving the, quote, social and cultural cohesion, according to the bill's wording. In other words, preserving Jewish purity and ethnic supremacy. And so these numbers have gone up since this was written, but in 2023, we have Israeli forces and settlers. They've killed more than 195 Palestinians. In 2020, this year, we have Israeli military courts have issued more than 1,608 administrative detention orders, the practice of imprisoning Palestinians without charge or trial, based on, quote, secret evidence that is not required to be disclosed to the defendant nor the defendant's legal team. And currently there are 1,132 Palestinians being held in administrative detention, including 18 children and minors. And then today there's a new report on Middle East Eye that the Israelis, the IDF has killed a 15-year-old Palestinian boy in the West Bank. So a 15-year-old Palestinian boy was killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank on Tuesday evening. The Palestinian Health Ministry named the victim as Mohammed Farid al-Zarir, who was killed near the illegal Israeli settlement of Shema, close to Hebron. And according to local Palestinian sources, Zarir was one of the top students in his class and had just finished 9th grade. The Israeli military claims that Zarir looked suspicious as they passed a bus station and decided to approach him for interrogation. They claim he pulled out a knife, and so they shot and killed him. And so this has been, as they point out here, one of the deadliest years for Palestinians. A report in 2022 by the Israeli rights group Yesh Din found that less than 1% of soldiers accused of harming Palestinians between 2017 and 2021 were ever charged with crimes. The military law enforcement authorities systematically avoid investigating or prosecuting soldiers who harm Palestinians. So now we have at least 204 Palestinians killed by Israeli fire this year, including 36 children. So that's nearly one fatality per day, and 167 of those have been killed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, making 2023 one of the bloodiest years in the occupied territories. And of course, another 36 have been killed in Gaza in the major bombing campaign in May. And so it's just putting all that in perspective. It's pretty disgusting to see that the pretense of Israeli democracy, the PR of covering up this apartheid state and trying this despotism and settler colonial travesty to try and cover it up and make it look like it's just, they're just like us and they're just besieged by these Arab hordes and terrorists at all times, and that we have to help them defend themselves. It's just absolutely disgusting, and it's good to see that Netanyahu is creating all these problems in terms of driving a wedge between the Americans and the Israelis, but I think it's all really just at this point, just rhetoric. I don't see it really changing the relationship, but the American people definitely should.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update, and we'll be back with more shows next week.